Thank you. It's my pleasure. It's an honor and privilege to get asked to speak. My name is Doreen, and I am an alcoholic. My sobriety date is April 11th, 2013, and I'm sober today by the grace of God, the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the fellowship, who I seriously underestimated the power of love in getting me through the rough first times, that I tried to enter the rooms. And, it's just kind of one of the best kept secrets, I think, because you kind of learn along the way these things. And so it's just wonderful, to be on these Zoom meetings. I look and I see, this wonderful quilt of all of these wonderful faces. It's hard to tell who the newcomers are because we all have a front row seat. Usually you look in the back, that's where I used to sit because I thought that's where all the squared away people would sit, in the back up against the wall. No one's going to know I'm a newcomer. Gosh, it's kind of funny to see. But anyway, it's really, really good to be here. It looks like, gosh, we have close to 220 people. Yeah, no pressure. I'm glad it came across that I didn't hesitate because I always do hesitate whenever I'm asked. I'm still an alcoholic. I still have an ego. I still am who I am. I'm one of these people that I'm kind of an introvert, don't really like to talk too much. I like to stay to myself. I think a lot of alcoholics are like that. It kind of helped me along, because alcoholism is a disease of loneliness. And I took to that really well. And so it is wonderful to be here. And so, just a little bit how it got started. I wasn't one of those that started drinking really early, but I did notice alcohol early on in my life. My parents were very hardworking people. My dad was a timber faller. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. Wasn't a lot of love and, physical affection. It was very task-oriented. We're on the farm. We're planting vegetables. We're raising beef. There was always chores to do. And task, it's just like a task-oriented life, very regimented. And so what I noticed is whenever they started drinking in the household, something came into the household that wasn't ever there. There was a sense of levity, a jocularity. My parents, would banter with each other, and they would tease each other. It was just a lot of fun, and I just loved it then whenever we would have our holidays, and our cousins would come over, and they would start drinking, and man, and the house just got loud and it got happy. And I was super excited, to be a part of that. It was just something that, I don't know, I was just highly attracted to. And then just knowing that this magic elixir, wasn't allowed to be drank by the kids. And it just kind of added another element of mystery to it. But I knew and I understood what it was at a very early age. And I just couldn't wait to get my chance to have a part of that. And it came pretty early on, probably when I was about 14 or 15, the first time that I remember drinking, we went out to cut Christmas trees. And my parents let us make these things called Snuggles in the Snow. It's where you get your mug and you pop a piece of whipped marshmallow cream down the bottom. You put some hot chocolate in there, and then you float a little peppermint schnapps on the top. And that was a lot of fun. Then, of course, as the day goes on, the ratio starts changing a little bit where you start adding a little hot chocolate to the peppermint schnapps. And it was a lot of fun. And so by the time we got out to where we were going, I was pretty well lit. But I just remember just that warm, wonderful powerhouse feeling. I wasn't afraid to slide on my sled. I didn't get cold. I didn't get mad at my sisters. They're actually kind of fun to play with. My cousins, we all got along great. And so on the way back, we threw the Christmas tree in the back. We sang all the way back home. And whenever we got home, instead of throwing the Christmas tree in the yard and decorating it the next day, we decorated it that night. And we continued on. And it was just this wonderful experience. But one thing that I took notice of, and I didn't notice it until I came into sobriety and I started looking back, what was the beginning moments of my sobriety is that night whenever they put the bottle away. I saw that there's probably about a quarter left in the bottle. And I saw that wasn't going to be enough. And, that should have been a red flag to a 14, 15-year-old, but I didn't see it at the time. I can't tell you what we had to eat that day. I know that we always had potato salad because I don't like potato salad. But I don't know how much was left over, but I don't know anything else about the day as far as the food and whatnot, but I remember how much alcohol was left in that bottle. And so I didn't really dabble too much after that. Went on, graduated high school, moved out of home, at a very young age, went out into the world, tried to find myself, ended up landing the job of a lifetime. It's one of those things that you try out and you don't realize how much you're going to like it until you start doing it. It's like, wow, I found it. But, it's just kind of hard for me to fit in a little bit. I was a country bumpkin and I was a female in a predominantly male profession. And I just really wasn't fitting in. And so whenever I got off probation from that job, they invited me to this thing called choir practice. And I didn't know what choir practice was because I never showed my talents and I'm certainly not a singer. But they invited me to this choir practice. And so what the choir practice is you find a dead-end road somewhere, a couple people bring barbecues and they bring food and they bring a lot of alcohol. And I found my friend again. And so whenever I drank that night, it's just like, oh yeah, I remember this now. And so that was just like, that alcohol did for me what I couldn't do for myself. And so I came out of my shell. And so that's what I started to do, on the weekends and almost every day after work is we'd go to choir practice. And I found that I could cuss like the guys and I could be foul with the guys and I could drink like the guys. And so that gave me a sense of entitlement. I became one of the guys. They didn't see me as one of the, people off in the corner. I became one of the guys. And so it gave me a key in that I didn't realize at the time how poisonous that was because it just was a sense of entitlement. I started getting better evaluations. I started getting better training, which got me a lot of cool assignments. And so my life just took off. It rocketed out. It was a lot of adrenaline, working hard, playing hard. And what could make it better? Well, to meet someone else that was in the, similar profession, just a different agency. And guess what? He was a drinker like me. But the thing is he wasn't an alcoholic, so I can even outdrink him. And so that even gave me a more sense of entitlement. So we ended up getting married. Our life just kind of took off. Things got kind of weird with him. And he had to leave his profession. He had to retire as a result of post-traumatic stress. There were some things that happened in his career that prevented him from being able to continue on. So he retired post-traumatic stress. We didn't like where we were living anymore because it was too much of a trigger for him, to see some of his old coworkers. So we did a geographic up to Redding, California, Northern California. And it was a wonderful move. We did everything that we thought we were supposed to do in order to make us happy. We had the house built. We had the perfect landscaping. We had the pool. We had it all. And but I still felt empty. And one of the things that made it really difficult with this emptiness is he thought it would be a good idea to stop drinking. And, he didn't have trouble with it. He didn't talk about it. He didn't say how uncomfortable it was, but I did. But I didn't say anything. Another red flag goes up the pole, of things that we don't realize until years later. And there's just some parts in the big book that kind of mentions about that, on the top of page 34 in the big book, it talks about, it's some, we're years beyond the point of where we could have stopped. But could we really stopped? And there's no evidence of that because we never did, because usually we're years beyond that point. And I can see that now. Gosh, if I would have had the level of honesty, if I would have had a little bit of the programming, who knows? But we can't look at it that way. And I just choose to say, okay, well, it didn't happen, so let's move on. My journey didn't have that element. And so whenever I would leave and go on assignments, that would be the first thing that I would do before I got to my hotel, is stop off at the local wherever, make sure that I had enough alcohol, go to my room and get drunk and call my husband. He liked that a lot, and he just didn't like me leaving town anymore. But anyway, as the great manipulator that I was, At some point, I did convince him that it was a good idea that we started drinking again, because golly, you know, what's the harm in that? So then he gave me permission to go to the store and get him a 6-pack. And so, I mean, I know better than that, right? Whenever I get to the store, I get him the 36-pack for him. For me, I got a bottle of wine. And then for the closet, I got a bottle of vodka, you know, because that's just the seemed like the thing to do. And so that's just how I drank, you know. I'd get my little teeny glass of wine, you know, I'd only pour like a little teeny bit because that bottle had to last me a whole week, right? And I could just get so drunk off of that little bit of wine. And he just thought that I was the most delicate, fragile flower about how drunk I could get off of just a little teeny bit of wine. And I just thought that was so sweet of him to think that. But anyway, you know, it just goes from bad to worse. As things continued on, you know, that marriage fell apart. I ended up getting a divorce. It was kind of ugly, but it ended okay. But then I remember the day, you know, that I'm finally, after all the dust had settled, I'm like, you know what, now I'm not accountable to anybody. And I'm just going to be able to drink like I want to drink. And so what did I do to celebrate? I decided that I wanted to go to a wine tasting. That is the worst place an alcoholic could ever go. Anybody been to a wine tasting? Yeah. Yeah, when you're an alcoholic. I guess I should have read the rules before I got there. You're supposed to spit it out. And so whenever I saw these people were spitting them out, I was like, oh my gosh, what are they doing? And so they'd spit it out and start eating crackers. It's like, what the heck is wrong with them? They're such lightweights, you know, they're such kids. So anyway, so I actually convinced the people to actually give me more than a sip. And then I told them, you know, look at how tall I am. Look at how big I am. You know, I need a bigger sip. So I was able to convince them to allow me to get drunk at that wine tasting. It was just fantastic, you know. But it just goes to show you, you know, what we do. You know, we go to any lengths, you know, and I walked out of there not buying a single bottle of wine, but I was pretty well on my way for nothing. So it continues on, you know, all these red flags. I remember then shortly after that, I experienced my first blackout. And, you know, blackouts, you know, I heard about them. I didn't believe that it actually happened. I thought that they were just an excuse that people used, you know, for their poor behavior by saying, oh, you know, I don't remember, so I can't be responsible, you know, for my actions. But it actually happened to me. And I just remember how terrified I was. It got me, you know, I couldn't drink for a week because I was afraid of what would happen. But this is also what was happening, is the spiritual erosion that starts to happen. And it's just so subtle. It's the other portion of the cunning, baffling, and powerful is just a slow spiritual erosion. So after about a week, I drank again and I blacked out again. That scared me sober for 3 days. I drank again, I blacked out. It scared me sober for 2 days. And finally I just started looking around. It's like, okay, well, you know, nothing's really happening. I'm not going anywhere. It's okay. I'm not responsible. No one's taken notice, and perfectly fine, right? If I'm not having any consequences, you know, is it so bad? And then I started having other sorts of spiritual erosion where, you know, I am kind of coming to, and I realize that it's 7 o'clock in the morning and I'm so drunk I can barely stand up. I remember stuff like that used to be really, really funny, and I would laugh my head off as I was taking another shot out of the vodka bottle. Yeah, because by then I stopped using a glass, you know, and that didn't stand out to me. I started thinking, it's like, you know, I don't want to pour it in the glass because just a little bit of residue that goes in the glass, I saw that as wasted alcohol, and I'd always try to lick the glass, and I thought, God, you know, let's just cut that, you know, let's just cut that little step out, and I'll just drink right out of the bottle. And so, you know, that was a classy way that I was drinking, you know, just to save on dishes and to save on, you know, wasting the residue in my glass. And so little things then started to happen. You know, I started waking up outside, you know, started getting into this routine that every time I would come to, you know, I'd look on my phone. Who did I call? Who did I text? You know, if I didn't, I'd check that off my list. I'd go run into the garage. Is my car still there? There's no damage. check that off the list. Make sure that my dogs are still there. Yeah. And so if nothing was wrong, then it was like it wasn't happening and I was okay. Um, until, one morning I get up and I saw that I'd called and texted my friend Sam, several times. I'm like, oh, geez, I wonder what I said this time. I'll give him a call and apologize to him later, and find out, ask the everlasting question. So what did I do? What did I say? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Forgive me. Please forgive me. And they always did. But this morning, I was walking down, the hallway in my house. I saw these black marks on the wall. I'm like, uh-oh. Something happened. I wonder what happened. And so I better figure it out. So I go out into my living room and there's my best friend, Sam, laying on my couch, and he sits up and he's all bloody, like he'd been in a fight. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened to you? And he said, you don't remember? And I said, no, was I there? What happened? And he goes, you called me last night and you said you're going to blow your brains out with your shotgun. I go, oh. And he goes, and whenever I got over here, sure enough, when you opened the door, you'd racked around and you were going to stick your mouth over the end of that shotgun. And he goes, so I fought you. And I got that shotgun out of your hands and I was able to unload it. And you beat the living bejesus out of me. Okay, I unmuted myself. And just that sinking cold feeling that you get, it's like, oh my God, And he didn't tell anybody, but it certainly motivated me to do something. So I decided that I was going to go to rehab. So I voluntarily went on my own, asked my boss if I could go. They didn't believe that I needed to go. So I kind of told them a little bit, that I'm blacking out and I really have strong, problem with alcohol and I just want to get better. So I went and did 30 days in an inpatient treatment down in Angels Camp, which is in California. I learned everything there that I needed to learn. They told me to get a sponsor. They told me to work the steps. They told me to get involved in the program and to take it seriously and be honest. One of the things that I noticed there is I finally saw the 12 steps on the wall. What really stood out to me was the first word in the step 1. It said we. I didn't understand that. I thought it should be I. I admitted that I was an alcoholic. And I didn't do anything that I was supposed to do. But I did try to go to meetings when I came back. One of the first meetings that I went to was one of the bigger meetings in Redding at the time, and it had well over 150 people on every Friday night at the Yaks. And I went there and I walked in with my ego and all of my illusions intact because I didn't want to look like a newcomer, heaven forbid. And I sat in the back with all the other old timers, right? And listened to the man tell his story, and his name was Carl. And Carl told his story, and he said that one night, whenever he was in a blackout, that he was driving his big truck and he went head on into this little car. It was a little Dodge Neon. And there was a local high school soccer star that was driving that car. And he did not kill her, but he paralyzed her from the neck down. And he explained his guilt, shame, and remorse about that. And I just felt really terrible for him, and I just felt this sinking feeling, but then it just really wasn't hitting me. And then the next thing that he said is that 7 days later after that accident, he started drinking again. And I just remember I sat back in my seat and I started looking around and it's like, what? Are you kidding me? And I had such judgment of this man. It's like, why do they have someone like that up on the stage? That they're so selfish and self-centered that they're going to be drinking again after that accident. What type of a meeting is this? And I just knew that I was in the wrong place. And so I never went back because I thought that was absolutely insane. Who would do such a thing, right? At that point, I probably had about 40 days of sobriety. Within 2 days, I was drinking again. And within a matter of weeks, I was worse than ever. And so I just couldn't get it. having enough AA in me, but not being able to understand the we, not understanding the relationship, just kind of skimming over the book saying that that's not me. I just needed a little bit more research. And so then I just got into this pattern, of getting up, going to work, on my way home, grabbing a bottle, drinking the whole thing, blacking out, going to work. I would buy a bottle of vodka every day, even though I had a case of it sitting in my garage, because that was for an emergency, right? So I remember one time I had to get into my emergency stash. So I'm taking one bottle out of a case of vodka, and it freaked me out so bad that the next day I went and bought another bottle of vodka, replaced it, but then I bought another case because I need two now. But I still bottle a bottle of vodka every day. I mean, who does that, right? And so, I just kind of got into the same routine, where I'd get up in the morning, I'd come to check my phone, check the car, check the dogs. One morning or one late at night, I come to, but this story was a little bit different. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm behind the wheel of my car. This has never happened before. And I looked down and I was dressed, and like the last thing I remember, I was getting ready for bed. I was totally unaware of what time it was. So then, you just have that tunnel vision, just kind of in and out of a blackout. I get out of my car and I go to the front and I see that I'd rear-ended somebody. And then the rest of it was kind of sketchy. I know that there were a lot of lights and a lot of commotion going on. The next thing I remember, I'm handcuffed and I'm in the back of a police car. And, to the right of me, one of my coworkers is there. I'm like, what are you doing here? And she goes, Doreen, just go along with the program. And she was very stern with me. And I'm like, I thought I was going along with the program. And then a little time later, in the left door, it was one of my supervisors. And he goes, Doreen, shut up and go along with the program. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought I was. And so I just remember a little bit of the ride to the jail. I remember a little bit of the booking process. I remember, being there, in a cell by myself all night. And I tried to get the guards to talk to me. Don't you know who I am? Come talk to me. Tell me what happened. They wouldn't talk to me. So then I got released with the court date. As soon as I get outside, who do I call? I call my best friend, Sam. Come help me, please, come help me, please, please, please. Because, it wasn't good enough that I could just ask like an adult. No, I had to cry and I had to get all manipulated. And so he showed up there and so I get in the car and so tell me, what did I do? What did I do? And he wouldn't tell me. In fact, he wouldn't talk. So he drove me to my house and he just pulled up to the front. And I really wanted him to come inside because all of a sudden I was really scared and I begged him to come inside. Please, don't leave me here by myself. And he just looked at me with just a stone cold face and he says, I can't do this anymore. Don't call me. Don't text me. You need to figure this out. So I ran into my house and I turned on my TV because I would record the news. And there it was on my big plasma screen TV, my booking photo. It said CHP officer, rear ends 4 cars, injures 7 people. 3 cars. Rear ends 3 cars and injures 7 people. And my heart just sank. Because I know that whenever you're involved in a DUI accident and you've been drinking, any injury is considered to be a felony. And I knew that as a police officer, my career was over. And I remember looking around my house and all the things that I used to take for granted, all of a sudden desperately meant something. And never in my life had I wanted to be more sober than that moment. But it didn't stop there. So I went through the process. The DA's office was looking at giving me 6 years state prison. That scared me. I thought that I had experience, and thinking, first offense, that possibly couldn't happen. But that's not what my attorney told me, So I was very scared. How do you prepare for going away for 6 years? So I did what I thought that I should do. I liquidated everything, sold everything in my house, sold my house, sold all my decorations that I had that I thought, made me happy in my life. But I tell you, it didn't. Come time, the day that I was standing before the judge, I showed up there drunk. I didn't quit drinking. Pretty ballsy of me to show up there with alcohol on my breath, but I did. I couldn't help it. I'm an alcoholic, for crying out loud. So instead of sending me away, I got a huge break that day. Whenever a police officer is arrested, for that many felonies, they have to put him in protective custody. It's just a fancy way of saying solitary confinement, because they don't want us around other people and they don't want other people around us. I don't know why. I get along well with others, right? But it was for my protection. And so instead of actually going away, they put me on an ankle monitor. And for any person, that would have been a huge break. I didn't see it that way. I did not see it that way at all. I was so insulted that, they then ordered me, to go to an AA meeting every day. So I'd go to my AA meeting, then on the way home, I'd grab my bottle and go home and get drunk. Isn't that the way you do it, So anyway, as I was going along, the darkness just got darker. And boy, anybody who's ever been in that place, you know what I mean. I think only a real alcoholic can understand it, when the darkness gets a little darker and it just feels like it's, the days are made of syrup and you just can't get by. But then something else, as far as a mental twist started happening, where I started getting really comfortable in that darkness. I started looking forward to it. My taste of music changed. It was just a very short period of time, but then a thought started coming through my mind and I had a plan. So I went into my best friend's house and I sharpened a knife and I cut my ankle monitor off and I ran. And I went down to the local CVS and I bought my last bottle of booze. And then I ran and I ran and I ran until I found a beautiful place under a tree and I attempted suicide. And I remember at the point where I thought that I was dying, I just thanked God. I said, thank you, God. I feel so relieved that it's finally over. But what I didn't know is that I wasn't going to get my way, that it was over, that God had other plans for me. And so whenever I kind of came out of that, I had the most unusual experience. It's hard to put it into words. And I almost feel a little uncomfortable to share it because it was such a personal experience, but I'll do the best I can to try to put it into words. Is in my heart area, there was like this warm, wonderful peace and calm. And it wasn't words, but it just told me that everything is going to be okay. But I had a lot of stuff going on up here. It was just a lot of jagged, harsh, rough edges, a lot of chaos saying, oh my gosh, you're going to have to face, you're going to, you just failed, suicide attempt. How stupid are you? And all this other stuff. And now you know what the consequences are going to be. But then it just got overwhelmed by this, everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be all right. And so I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? Get up. So I got up. Make a phone call. And I made a phone call. And I turned myself in. So that was April 11th, was the day that I had my last drink. And so on April 11th, the following day, that's how I started my first day of sobriety, handcuffed to a hospital bed, being stitched and stapled shut. I stabbed myself 13 times. And I don't know how I survived it. But sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes we're called to a higher purpose. And I don't want to sound arrogant whenever I say that, because I tell you, it's not something that I really wanted to do. But I survived it. I did, 2 weeks, in the medical ward in Shasta County. I served the rest of my time up in Susanville. But there are two things that I received whenever I was in jail in Shasta County. It was this very book, of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. And those were given to me by hospitals and institutions. And so if there was ever a time when that pink can went around and you thought that dollar that you put in or the couple pieces of change that you put in there, if you didn't think that it went to help somebody or could save a life, I want to let you know that that's where I got the books that worked. And so I hold them very near and dear to me today. They're falling apart, but I'm not. And so I started to read. And I knew just enough, as far as the first 164 pages, I knew just enough to know about the steps, that I wasn't to do those on my own, that I needed a sponsor. But what I did grab hold of is the stories in the back. And, just recently, I've had the experience of being able to read those stories again, and they have a whole new, different flavor to them. And it's just so wonderful, to read them now, because back then, 7 years ago, just a small little 7 years ago, I would read those stories and I could really relate to how people got into Alcoholics Anonymous. I could really relate to that. But whenever they got to the part of the recovery, I couldn't, because I wasn't there yet. But it gave me so much hope, story after story. And I limited myself. I only would allow myself to read one story a day, but I could read it as many times as I wanted, but I could only read one a day. And that got me through many days of just wanting to read it again. So then I started reading, the first 164 pages. I started reading the 12 steps and 12 traditions. It really didn't touch me. I don't really remember too much of the beginnings, but I just remember the stories. And what I noticed about the stories, whenever they would talk about God and how they got to their bottom and kind of the things that they did in order to get out. And I realized that there was one thing that I'd never done before in my entire life. I never asked for help. And so I did. And so I got down on my knees and I said, God, help me. God, help me. And he did. And it was just a whole new world opened up for me. But I was still very scared. I only did 58 days, but it felt like 58 years. And I was so scared of what was going to happen whenever I finally got out. Because at that point, those 58 days of sobriety were so precious to me. Because I know the only amount of time that I could wrap together prior to that is what I got in rehab. And that was only 42 days. But I remember the struggle after I lost that 42 days, that the most that I could put together was 20 days. Then the most that I could put together was 7. Then in the very end, the most I could put together was a lucky 24 hours. I just knew that I couldn't do it. And so with all the desperation of any dying person can be, I'm like, I am not going to lose this 58 days. In fact, I'm not going to count it until I double it. And so whenever I got out of jail, that's when my true journey began. There was a lot of things that happened during that time, a lot of ups, a lot of downs, but I did exactly what was suggested. I got a sponsor and I worked the steps the best to my ability that I could. It wasn't very well. It was just truly skimming the surface. That sponsor was so gracious. She got me my first job at a recovery center. I got to work as an intern, as a drug and alcohol counselor. They paid special favor on me. You're supposed to have 5 years of sobriety in order to have that position. And I had, not even quite one, but they let me in. And what I had the benefit of being able to do there is they would give us, the curriculum to share with the group sessions. So I'd cheat. I'd read that and I would get absorbed and then I would give it away as if I'm teaching them something. It's like, man, I can tell by the looks on these people, I'm getting more out of this than they are. And I felt kind of guilty about that. But you know what? It gave me a sense of enthusiasm, that the other counselors didn't have. It's like, I'm just getting this stuff for the first time. And man, this stuff is great. The we part of the program. And like, oh, geez, maybe we should have waited, until she got at least 5 years. But I did okay in that job, It was it was the best thing that could have happened to someone like me at the time. But then, when there's an up, there's also a down. It was shortly after, doing that job. My sponsor who worked over in the inpatient, I worked in the outpatient side because I was still, on felony probation. Woo, that was kind of fun. She showed up to work with alcohol in her breath. So they tested her. And so she tested positive for alcohol and methamphetamine and was immediately discharged. And for someone, that just had, a little bit of sobriety, someone that was, completely entrusted, that just kind of took the wind out of my sails. But I'm so glad that I was there at that recovery center because I got exactly what I needed. I got surrounded by my coworkers and my boss. They encouraged me to delve deeper into, going to more meetings, outside. The recovery center was one thing, but you still need to go to meetings. So then you can absorb instead of constantly giving it away. It's a give and take. You need both. You can't shut yourself off from one, or you're going to be lopsided. So I found, another sponsor, and I did the steps again to the best of my ability, but this time it was different. I didn't pick somebody that I thought would be easy. I didn't pick somebody that I thought would be my friend. I listened with other ears because I was so desperate, because I thought, I just took a big hit with having my sponsor relapse. I know what I need to do. I need to find somebody that's talking a program and living a life that I want to live. And I picked this lady, and we were oil and water. I tell you, it was ugly. And I saw her as being like the meanest person ever, because, man, she would just look at me. She didn't cry when I cried. And I didn't realize what a loving gesture that was, especially whenever I got to my 4th step inventory. I'm telling her all the big things. And she would just sit there with her arms crossed and just cock her head, give me that look. And then she'd do one of these every once in a while. Whenever I got to the point where I thought I'd make her cry, she'd say, "Is that it? Is that it?" I'd be like, "Yes." So then it gave me permission to tell the rest of it. I didn't know what that felt like until I started sponsoring other women, to have that level of love, to have that level of disconnect so they can get it out, all of it, to the best of their ability. They may not get all of it, but to the best of their ability. That's my part as a sponsor. And so I hold that woman in high regard. She didn't give me permission to use her name, but I hold that woman in very high regard today, as far as how I learned how to do the steps. But, things kind of go on, the way that I do it is, my sponsors can only take me so far. And whenever I've reached my limit, it's time to move on. I know that that's not how a lot of other people do it, and I hope that I'm not offending anybody, but that's the way that I do it. Because for me, my spiritual life, I see that it's endless, and I want to keep going. There's no limit to this. My recent experience, with the time that I have, is I hit a little bit of a flat spot, where it seemed like I was hearing the same things. It wasn't hitting me in the heart. It started making me a little uncomfortable. It's like, man, I don't feel like I'm going to drink, but man, I'm just not getting this thing. What a blessing that was, because I did what I did when I first came into the program, and I remembered, what was the most number one important thing that I learned whenever I first came in. And I thought, being uncomfortable, that was the gift that was given to me, is being uncomfortable. So that's actually been the worst thing of my sobriety. It's also been the best thing. Because what happens when you're uncomfortable? You pay attention. My ears go up. But it also gives me an opportunity to push through it. It's not that big of a deal. It's a wonderful skill for this person that, is an extreme introvert. And the thing is it doesn't last long, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. And then I'm not, uncomfortable anymore. What I learned today is if I'm still uncomfortable after about 5 to 10 minutes, then I just delve into being a little bit more uncomfortable, where, oh my gosh, I'm going to talk to somebody. Or I'm going to make a phone call to somebody that I don't know. These are gifts. Learning to say yes and being uncomfortable with the yeses. I still struggle with that. When people ask me to share, Steve, thank you for thinking that I said yes right away, but I always say no in my head, every time. But I push through it because I know that I have evidence now. I have experience with saying yes. What has yes brought me? It has brought me a life beyond my wildest dreams. Just being able to push through those little pieces of uncomfortable, there's something wonderful on the other side. So that's what I use as far as what I'm doing today, is seeing those uncomfortable moments as gifts. Even if it's an uncomfortable moment where I have to go tell my supervisor that I did something wrong, or going to do a 10th step amends, as uncomfortable as that is, I don't concern myself with how the other person is, how they may respond. I'm just grateful that I have the ability to own my own stuff. I have the ability to right my own wrongs. I don't have to hide from them anymore. And most of the time, something wonderful happens. Either I get a gift from God or I learned a gift of a lesson. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. And I'm so just so happy to be a part of this program. I'm so happy to be a part of the fellowship, and looking out at all of you. These Zoom meetings are just wonderful. Hearing people come on and logging in and saying where they're from, hearing all their different accents from all over the world. We have 230 people now. So in 230 places right now, my voice is being heard. And it's not me. It's because of the grace of God has given me the ability to do this, because it's not me. So thank you so much. That's all I have tonight. And I'm just so happy to be here. Thank you so much, Steve, for asking me to share.